After Ptolemy went down, the rest of our institutions fell in rapid succession. Science suffered from a catastrophic replication crisis. There was a typo in the paper of record, which wiped out the last of the media's credibility. The military is laid low by a wave of rampant venereal disease. A new one, some scrub picked it up from a prostitute in Mongolia, and soon they all had it. You know, they're murderers too. Nobody ever brings that up. Anyway, there was no organized group left except artists. That's a lot of heavy lifting from the word organized. And some of the artists could do heavy lifting. The Burning Man crowd with their outdoor installations and whatnot. So they had might and muscle enough to reshape society under their own rule until all was art and decadence. At first, things went better than most people anticipated. All of a sudden, everyone could just sit around and be creative all day. Everything was art. Communication, currency, there's our lingua franca, our stock and trade. Art was everything, and everything was art. Eventually, things started to go wrong. The kind of logistical and engineering and plumbing problems that you might expect. Much of society was plunged into poverty and chaos. We needed catharsis. We needed really good art from people with skill and talent, whatever that is. You can dismiss it. It's like charisma. It's undeniable up close, and you want it to be around when you need it. There was good, purgative art that came out of that period, but eventually fascism crept in. Artists have poor ideological immune systems. There was an appetite for order and structure that was promised by snobs. They were friends with a lot of celebrities, and they were always right. No one else matters. We're a bunch of neurotics. This is intoxicating to be around. The worldview does have its hazards and limitations, but the snobs rapidly consolidated their power in spite of a few internal struggles, to which most of us were kept unprivy. The snobs presented a relatively unified front, and they had good aesthetics. They dug up some really good art from the underground that got a wider audience. It took the edge off of the societal collapse that was happening for long enough for the snobs to move in and do everything correctly until they got worn out, and then put other people to work and look over their shoulders to make sure they were doing everything correctly. Art was still what mattered, and a very specific sort of art. It was disproportionately privileged. Think of ball-swinging, sleazy 70s rock music. The kind of stuff that you might use to pump yourself up for a date that you were really insecure about by somebody who was hoping to get dommed. Confidence is easily mistaken for competence. Cracks started to show in the art society after the snobs had been in charge for a while. The national defense was something called Darvo, classic slaying of the messenger, playing the victim role themselves, complaining that they were misunderstood, that their interest in professional wrestling was more pure than anything else in this corrupted world, and y'all just ain't ready for it. Max Sinclair was a different kind of scientist. He survived the replication crisis and managed to align himself with the snobs that had taken over the government through his charisma and work that was multidisciplinary and enigmatic, so that no one person really had the qualifications to argue with him. He was running a series of interesting experiments for the government. The snobs had come up with a scale for aesthetic value. On one of their Zoom calls, somebody jokingly brought up the idea that, hey, maybe we could punish people for bad aesthetics. Like physically punish them, like torture them, like, yeah, bitch, take that. What do you think of Led Zeppelin now, huh? Oh, you want your dignity back? Why don't you go steal it from a black person, bitch? Everyone laughed, including Sinclair, who was outranked by that member and always knew when to bring the courtesy laughter, but a light bulb went on in his remarkable brain. He sought the services of Laura Harper, brilliant psychology graduate student who is a big fan of Sinclair's and keenly interested in the darker side of human nature and not interested in a disinterested way. Her ardently affectionate boyfriend, Daniel Hayes, who managed to get his grades up so he could tag along with Laura to college, was skeptical and protective as usual and never liked Sinclair at all. It's hard to believe they could exist on the same planet. Together, Sinclair and Laura came up with an idea, leveraging a network. Prior to the rise of the Art Society, concurrent with the fall of everything else, the government had been controlled by a group that was dedicated to the cross-societal elimination of cringe. Among many other things, they installed breathalyzers in any electronic device that was connected to the internet. And before you could log up or boot on or whatever, you had to blow just high enough to be witty, but not high enough to make an ass of yourself. It's a fine line. That's one of the factors that led to the fall of that government. Point being, the breathalyzers were all connected. It was a system with very few holes in it, because when things go wrong, that's cringe. And Sinclair had the idea that the same system could be just as easily used to administer electric shocks. And when people expressed bad opinions about aesthetics, or put bad art out there for unwitting consumers to stumble on, they could be tortured for that. Somebody would have to administer the shocks. Laura was almost ready to volunteer. She didn't even care about art. She liked David Lynch, she'd seen, but she was highly interested in torture. Her bookshelf was lined with books on corporal punishment. She'd been wanting to study E-STEM, but hadn't really had the chance until now. Laura was intuitively fluent in the language of power and perversity. She put out a highly effective ad soliciting people from across the spectrum of society to come in and try out as for the role of administering electric shocks to people with bad taste. Some of them got way too into it, to the point of pure cringe. Teenage goth. Sadism as pure, transparent overcompensation. Cringe had become kind of fashionable, and the job was getting done. Volunteers were signing up on both sides. Unemployed former art critics at the stands of various performers, casual aficionados, all signed up to get shocks when they had wrong opinions. Having right opinions was important to them, and they realized that the best way to learn is to have some skin in the game, and you remember things that hurt. Pain is just bad taste leaving the body. Laura started to notice some irregularities in both groups, but it didn't bother her much. She was having very liberated, exuberantly creative, extremely decadent, and mutually degrading sex with Sinclair every single night. Daniel had a lot of free time on his hands, and he was doing a little investigation of his own. After Laura figures it out, it's hard for her to believe she couldn't see it before. This study is self-selecting for sadists and masochists. Obviously, sadists giving the shocks and masochists taking them. Masochism can be a pretty good adaptation in a society like this, and the few non-masochists that got shuffled into the subject pool were masochists by the time it was over. If one was caught visibly enjoying the electric shocks, they switched to slime falling from overhead, like the show on Nickelodeon. And some of them didn't like that, others did. Everything is someone's fetish. Never say that you'll never be able to date again. Somebody out there has a fetish for you. Anyway, the study did not work with vanilla types. Those giving the shocks were disgusted with themselves, and the ones taking them finally saw through the veil of the snobs. Who cares what subgenre of horror this is? Who could possibly care which of Mayo Thompson's albums are worth owning? Well, I do, but I wouldn't base a society on it. Laura didn't say anything because she wanted to continue exploring her true desires. While she was doing that, Daniel had found his mission and felt like he was becoming a man. He studied Sinclair's work in some depth. He wasn't born with a brain for this stuff. He was self-taught through immersion, and it was an impressively quick study. Found out in short order that the reason Sinclair escaped the replication crisis is because he created it. The whole thing was a massive hoax. Sinclair had framed all of his rivals in the discipline so that he would finally look impressive by virtue of standing alone. Academia is super bitchy, you don't even know. Daniel confided this in Laura, and Laura said she wasn't surprised, and in turn confided that she'd been taking the D from Sinclair for some time. She thought Daniel would be upset, but in fact, it opened a new dimension of his sexuality. He decided that he wanted Laura to sleep with other men all the time, which kind of took the fun out. Either way, by then she got more interested in the links between sex and violence, and how unconventional beauty was truly everywhere, and anyway, what did it matter? Society was crumbling around them. The snob government was weakening. The people whose feelings they hurt were collectivizing and rising up. The artists they dismissed as hacks leveraged their suffering and got really, really good. Through her study of power dynamics, the one thing Laura emerged certain of is that power is always in flux. It takes many shapes, and by the end of it, she became kind of a prude, but not before she wrote Sinclair until he fell asleep. She knew how to do, which gave Daniel a chance to sneak in. They stole some of Sinclair's papers, revealing his ruse, and he was exposed. The snobs tried to suppress it, but the media was making a hard comeback. The journalists were pissed and very drunk. After a few months, Daniel had become a decadent playboy. Laura had become a shut-in prude. She just stayed home every day, never saw anybody, never went out, barely used the internet, was happier than she ever imagined possible. She did have one house guest during that period. She invited Daniel to come over and drink watery domestic with her while they stood on her balcony and watched society finally collapse while they listened to William Basinski's disintegration loops on repeat. This was truly the most unconventional of beauty, which they celebrated with some very unconventional beauty of their own.